Hello, this is George from George's Music Blog, and today I'm talking about the debut album by Aphex Twin, Selected Ambient Works 85 to 92. Okay, this is a big one. There are countless people's opinions and summaries of this record on YouTube alone, so what am I going to tell you that others haven't already? I can't promise any special insider knowledge of Aphex Twin. I'm just a fan. His music had a massive effect on me when I first discovered it around 25 years ago, and he's been among my favourite musicians and recording artists ever since. That hardly makes me unique, and it is undeniable given his reputation, the mythology, and the sheer volume of appreciation for his work that he is a special artist. Even if you don't dig his music, you can't argue really with his popularity and the fact that there's no one else quite like him. So I'm yet another voice adding to the chorus, but I'll do my best to make it interesting. Hopefully you'll find something to agree with or disagree with, or failing that, you can just sit back and enjoy my take on this classic album. So, Selected Ambient Works 85-92 was Aphex's first full-length album, released in 1992. Funnily enough, given his long association with Warp Records, the venerable electronic music institution, synonymous with the intelligent dance music tag, this release actually came out on R&S Records, a Belgian label that was key in the early days of rave and remains an important player in electronic music today. And like so much that surrounds Aphex Twin, the title is completely misleading. Apart from one very short track that is around a minute long, barely any of the music is truly ambient, and it's unlikely much of it was recorded in 1985. According to Tom Middleton and Mike Paradinas, who both knew James at the time, most of the tracks feature the Roland R8 drum machine, which only became available in 1989. And according to Paradinas, James didn't get a sampler until 1989, so most of the music was probably created around or after that point. But self-mythology has always been Aphex Twin's modus operandi. He's always preferred to create mysteries and spread unlikely sounding stories rather than giving everything away. One thing that is accurate is that the tracks are all selected, in the sense of being drawn from a body of work that he'd recorded, with friends and label reps suggesting the best picks for the record, rather than this being an album that he recorded in one stint or with a consistent theme in mind. Now, if you're watching this video, then no doubt you've got some idea of this album's foundational place in electronic music. I'm going to qualify that sentiment shortly, but let's come back to that in a sec. If anything deserves to be described as seminal, then it is this album. And seminal really is the word, in the sense of this being the seed that spawned a whole scene, a genre that would go on spreading and splintering into multiple subgenres. This would come to be known as IDM, or intelligent dance music, a term that Richard James thought was laughable, and I think we can all agree is a pretty stupid label, for reasons too obvious to mention. But for all that, it is the term which seems to have endured and stuck around the longest, to the point where it's hard to avoid using it. Though at the time, I believe ambient techno was one of the more commonly used descriptions for this kind of music. The intelligent thing came about a bit later, following Warp Records' Artificial Intelligence series, which included releases by Black Dog Productions, Fuse, aka Richie Hawtin, Speedy J, Autechre, and of course a Richard D. James production, Surfing on Time Waves, released as Polygon Window. All seminal records too, which I will cover in other videos at some point. Saw 85-92 often seems to be held up as if it was the first word in cerebral, progressive electronic music, taking the forms of house and techno away from the dance floor and into people's headphones and living rooms. I think Pitchfork even ranked it as Aphex's best album on a list they did a little while ago, which seems a little bit weird to me. Personally, I don't actually find it his most interesting album, and it's kind of a shame to herald an artist's first work as their best, which basically implies they never again managed to do better than that. Though to be fair, I think the Pitchfork judgment was more about them trying to highlight its influence over and above its intrinsic worth as an album. Now, I wasn't around at the time it came out. Well, I was alive, but I wasn't tapped into the music scene. But I can't help but wonder if all this influence is sometimes a little bit overstated. Richard D. James didn't drop out of the sky, and Saw 85-92 wasn't beamed to Earth from space. He was clearly influenced by other musicians, whether fellow Brits who were taking the sounds of Chicago house and Detroit techno and mutating them in new ways, such as 808 State, key originators in the UK acid house scene, not to mention the originators of house and techno themselves, people like Juan Atkins, Kevin Saunderson, Derrick May, Larry Heard, to name just four. And of course, it's impossible, even for people who were there at the time, not to view the past retrospectively. Memory isn't a perfect record, and the passage of time always warps perceptions. But I think it's fair to say, yes, this record was foundational, seminal, and hugely influential, but still very much a part of the cultural continuum of electronic music. There's no denying Richard D. James was a prodigious talent. Even if the bulk of this record was recorded in 1989, that is still a monumental achievement, given his age, the equipment available to him, and the creativity and innovation he deployed to craft such a distinctive sound. What Aphex Twin accomplished on Saw 8592 was to take the grooves of Chicago house and the industrial ethos of Detroit techno and recast them in the rugged and beautiful landscape of his native Cornwall. So, without further ado, let's get into some of these specific tracks. Now, despite the fact that it is in some ways a compilation, Saw 8592 plays seamlessly as an album, and it is testament to the talent possessed by Richard D. James at such an early age that there are barely any weak moments and zero filler. In fact, the first half is practically flawless, opening with the iconic Xtal, which I learnt recently is perhaps intended to be pronounced crystal. Lush, warm, inviting. It's essentially a very straightforward and naive sounding track in comparison to much of his work, even his work at the time, never mind his later stuff. The instantly recognizable open and closed hi-hats, the wordless vocal sample, and the deep bath of tape hiss, almost a bit too hissy for my tastes. It has a kind of bit of a new age feel, and no doubt has soothed many addled ravers after a hard night of dancing. Bit of a rarity among Aphex tracks for having no dark side whatsoever. Even among his pretty and pleasant tracks, there's often an undercurrent of oddness, mischief, or just melancholy. But with Xtal or Crystal, it's like all the emotion is just purely on the surface. Beautiful stuff. Pulse width is another relatively straightforward cut, by which I mean straightforward in an emotional sense, not necessarily its construction, which is deceptively complex. Surging forwards on a joyously optimistic bass line and rave-adjacent synth chords, it manages to be pleasantly psychedelic, buzzy, and relaxing at the same time. It feels cliched to talk about music as timeless, but I'd argue so many of these tracks truly are. Yes, they're products of the change in consciousness that occurred following acid house and the rave scene, and are clearly of that time, but like the movement itself, they tap into something deeper. Human and spiritual connection, feeling at one with the natural environment. If you're wondering what I'm on about, then just listen to those serene synth pads and that gently pulsing beat on a decent sound system, and you'll hopefully see what I mean. One track that's come to be a favourite of mine over the years, clocking in at 9 minutes and second on the record, is Thar. It stands out to me thanks to its unusual construction. Despite the presence of an almost unrelenting and metronomic drum pulse, this is secondary to the dreamy ambience which comes in and out of focus, like the sight of land seen from a boat drifting offshore on a cloudy day. The lower notes of the bass refrain are among the best examples of James's touch for creating deeply comforting and human melodies. It's a classic Aphex technique to juxtapose a gentle melody with an industrial beat, and on Thar, the reverb drum hit, which just gives the mix that really unusual and distinctive feel. Aegispolis is another undeniable classic with that instantly recognizable synth melody, beneath which James creates a cavernous sense of space with a seemingly bottomless bass line and elastic drum pattern, which owes a significant debt to old school electro. But as is so often the case with Aphex, there's another dimension, as there's something again in the layers of melody and atmosphere that just transports this out of any genre context, and again taps into something numinous and timeless. Following the brief ambient interlude I, in raucous fashion, is Green Calx, something of an acid techno monster, a wobbling edifice of squelchy 303 bass and ricocheting drum machines that seems on the verge of collapse at any moment. It's got a pleasingly live feel to it, with filters being tweaked left and right, James summoning great bursts of noise like a manic wizard casting bolts of lightning. Heliosphan is another all-time favourite of mine. That synth melody and the rising chords are just simply glorious. It's almost like there's two tempos going on at once, with the twirling hi-hats going at double speed and the snare and bass drum combo, which almost sounds like someone just like hammering on a drum kit in their garage. There's a superbly lo-fi DIY feel to the whole composition, but that melodic idea is so strong you could play this track on a kid's xylophone and a couple of saucepans and it would still sound epic. I can't count how many times I've played this to soundtrack a post-rave come down. Life-affirming stuff. The second half of the record has slightly fewer iconic tracks, but it is still practically impeccable. Ptolemy is a slinky electro chugger driven by a squelchy bass line, Roland drum machines, and a hypnotic riff. We Are the Music Makers is unusual among Aphex tracks for featuring such a recognisable sample, in this case Gene Wilder as Willy Wonka in the 1971 film adaptation of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. It's pretty rare that James brings such a strong outside voice into his own musical universe. He did it a few times on early tracks. Think Julie Andrews from The Sound of Music on Supremacy 2. But whatever samples found their way into his later music would usually come free of any cultural baggage. The track boasts an almost dub-like bass line paired with synth notes at the top end. It's another sick track, and you could see that quote, "We are the music makers and we are the dreamers of dreams," as a one-line manifesto for the scene that became centered around him. And to be fair, it's a little bit more ambitious than Big Beats are the best get high all the time. Schottky, Seventh Path and Headfilm are both on the harsher side, with pounding industrial beats, ideal for a warehouse rave. Again, in contrast to the hard beats, James juxtaposes eerie, spooky melodies which elevate the tracks beyond pure rave fodder. The haunting keys on Schottky would fit well on a horror film soundtrack, and I'm almost tempted to liken them to the intro of Tubular Bells by Mike Oldfield, which obviously featured in The Exorcist, a classic horror film. And the reverb-saturated textures of Headfilm is of a piece with the deeply unsettling and moody Selected Ambient Works Volume 2. Finally, since I've managed to touch on pretty much every track, for completeness I will mention the penultimate piece, Delphium, which has a more noticeable Chicago house influence in the warm bass line and again, classic Roland drum machines. Big Larry Heard influence, I think, there. Actium as well is on the chilled side and has the kind of never-ending hypnotic bass line of the type that Richie Hawtin was so adept at creating. So yeah, at 74 minutes, Saw 8592 is a substantial listen, but thanks to how it's paced, it never feels like a slog. And although it plays perfectly as a sequential experience, because of the kind of compendium feel to it, you don't feel bad cherry-picking tracks now and then. So final reflections. It feels emblematic of dance music's DIY ethos, that the early home-recorded experiments of a Cornish teenager and Polytechnic dropout would go on to have such far-reaching influence. Tracks recorded in a small bedroom studio with limited gear, much of which had been customised and modified by Richard James himself in pursuit of crafting an original sound, given out to friends on tapes, while Aphex Twin was making a name for himself in the small but thriving rave scene in Cornwall. They eventually made their way to the offices of R&S Records in Belgium, and to use a well-worn cliche, the rest is history. Groundbreaking at the time, Saw 8592 was part of the blueprint for a whole scene and played a huge part in fostering the mystique around Richard D. James, which he has been more than happy to keep encouraging ever since. I discovered this record in the early 2000s, shortly after I'd first heard Drugs, and then proceeded to dive into the rest of the Aphex discography. At the time, the rave scene of the early 90s felt like something from a previous generation, though it's striking to realise now, almost 25 years later, that it was only really 10 years previous. A lapse that seems to pass all too quickly nowadays, such as the illusory telescopic nature of time. While it didn't blow my mind like some Aphex releases, it has been an incredibly faithful companion, and so many of these selected ambient works are among my favourite pieces of all music. It seems to keep getting discovered by subsequent generations to the point where it now almost seems to be a part of internet folklore. which surely just speaks to the timeless quality of the music. Anyway, we could go on and on, but I think that's enough from me. I'd love to hear your thoughts and memories of Saw 85 to 92, so please let me know in the comments. And as always, if you've stuck with me this far, then please give the video a like, as it really helps the channel to prosper. Thanks so much for watching. Goodbye.